Hello, I'm Miss Amber, dating this video on a cold January morning to bring you this reading resources for English 11A. So we've been going through the reading selections from each of the tutorials in the class. We're still in Unit 1 because there's a lot of selections, but the last video was specifically about the speech to the congressional convention written by Benjamin Franklin, but not delivered by him because he was too nervous to actually say it out loud. So what we're going to be looking at today is another reading selection in this lesson. This is the fourth lesson in Unit 1, which is Poetry in the Age of Reason. And I'm actually just going to jump right in. The reading that we're covering today is actually going to be a short excerpt that is actually in the lesson. And I'm covering it because I want to try to offer a little more understanding. I know that for some students, it's very difficult to look at the reading material and connect to the explanations that are in the tutorial. So I'm hoping that by going over it and explaining it a little more, I can offer a little extra insight. Now, there are a couple slides that we're going to go through before we get to the selection, the excerpt, just because there's a little bit of housekeeping to do. There's some vocabulary and some definitions that you need to know before you dive into these reading selections. So I want to make sure that everyone is prepared before we get into it. For those of you who are going to be looking at more than one of these videos for this lesson, don't worry, I'll be going over these slides at the beginning of the other videos as well, just to make sure that there are refreshers for everyone and that everybody knows what they need to know, or at least where to look before we dive into the selections. So I'm going to share my screen here, move myself up to this corner right here. And we're just going to dive in. It's just a little easier to just get started from the get-go. This is slide 10, so you need to be able to have gotten up to this slide. If you're watching this video, you've probably already gone through the tutorial once, and you're kind of like not sure, and you just want some review. So this is the start of the section on poetry. So this starts with elements of Revolution era poetry. So remember, this is during the American Revolution when America was fighting for freedom and independence from Britain. So this is the time period that we're talking about. We're talking about the late 1700s, maybe the early 1800s. That's where we're at time-wise. So they give you a list of vocabulary. It's not just this slide, it's also the next slide as well. So I'm just going to go over this. For any of the definitions that are very easy and simple, I'll just be reading it straight through. For anything that I think needs a little more explanation, I'll offer that. Now, this first one here is a couplet. A couplet is literally a pair or two lines that rhyme. That's it, a pair of rhyming lines. Pair meaning two. And when they say that they rhyme, they mean that the words at the end rhyme with one another. That's it. That's a couplet. Figurative language. So this is something that some students struggle with, but the biggest way to think of figurative language, well, we'll read the definition first and then I'll back it up. So it says here, non-literal language that helps readers imagine a description, adding clarity and meaning to the text. So the long and short of it is, anything that's figurative is not literal. The definition of literal is something that is actually happening in real time, straightforward, on the surface, on the nose definition. If I tell you that I am going to the store, that is a literal statement. There are descriptions. There's a description of me going or physically moving myself to the store. That is the location I'm going to end up at. So that's literal. If I wanted to be figurative, basically anything figurative is not literal. So when you use like creative language, flowery language, or when you add like a little twist of words to, like be witty, especially if you're talking about something that's not physically possible, that is what figurative language is. If it is not literal, it is figurative. So an example of a figurative way to tell you that I'm going to the store is I got to get there real fast, so I'm trying to fly to the store real quick. That would be an example. I am a human that doesn't have wings. I cannot literally fly, right? So flying, like flapping wings to be in the air, that's not possible for me. It's not in the cards, right? But if I say, I gotta go real quick, I'm about to fly down to the store, I'm using the description of flying to explain that I'm going to rush to get there very fast. I could say that I'm gonna run to the store, and that also means going somewhere fast. If I'm literally not running, so if I'm, driving or using a bike or something, then the word run would be figurative in that sense, because I'm using run to make you think of me going fast, but I'm not going to be literally running on my 2 feet. You see the difference? Whenever you use words creatively to describe something or give a feeling of a thing that is not happening exactly the way you say it, it is figurative. That's what figurative language is. So whenever we're talking about stuff that you would normally see in creative writing, so like when you make comparisons, her eyes were bright like the sun, right? No one's eyes are literally as bright as the sun, right? But we're comparing those things to give you a more, like flowery, complimentary, positive view of what this person's eyes are like. They shine bright. So literal is when it is happening exactly the way you say. But if you're using language in any other way to make something sound more interesting, more romantic, to bring out a feeling in someone, that is figurative language. Hopefully that clears it up. The next one is genre. This one's pretty simple. A classification or category of literature that is characterized. Characterized means these are the things that make up this thing. So when you talk about a person's character, like a human being's character, you're talking about what makes them them, right? Like the different parts, their personality, the things they like and dislike. When you're characterizing anything else, we're talking about the elements or pieces that make up that thing. So it says here, a classification of literature characterized by particular content and form. So content is substance, like what it's made up of, and form is how you express it, how it looks, how it shows, right? So a genre is basically a category that has its own rules and tropes that put it in that category. So for example, you would never call something like a rom-com where two characters are romancing each other and going through hijinks to get together. You would never call that type of movie a horror movie, right? Because horror movies have content that has to meet certain rules for it to be that type of film, right? We call those tropes or archetypes in English, but however it is you process it, it has to meet certain requirements to be in that category. For example, if you're talking about a fantasy novel or even a fantasy movie, it has to be something that involves magic or the supernatural, things that are not real, that are associated with other types of power that can't be classified by science, right? If it doesn't have those things in it, then it's not fantasy. And there are some other rules that you can think of, I'm sure, for different types of genres. So for example, if you've got an adventure novel, there's usually certain rules about there are different trials that test the hero. Sometimes there's a love interest that the hero has to be apart from for a long period of time. The villain is usually trying to, at least in terms of like epic hero stuff, take over the world or the region. Like whenever you are watching or reading something, you think, oh, duh, it's one of these stories because it has blank. You're talking about the rules that we don't question that put it into the category that it's in. So that category is called a genre. So again, just to cover that, genres, horror, fantasy, sci-fi, adventure, tragedy, rom-com. So those are popular for movies. There are some genres that get more complicated with books, because sometimes you'll have books that mix different elements of things. Murder mysteries, for example, is a genre where someone dies, and obviously you're either in a room or a building or a setting with a bunch of people who have to figure out what it is. Some people have done books and movies where maybe the murder mystery is being mixed with like horror. So people have to find out who the murderer is before a certain amount of time, where there's something bad that happens, that kind of thing. But the genre is the category. You can mix these categories together. So sometimes some books are more than one category. A book exclusive genre would be YA or young adult. There are certain books that are written for young adults. It usually involves certain types of characters, certain types of issues that are dealt with, like in the home life. And this is usually something that's combined with other genres too. So young adult can be combined with adventure. It can be combined with fantasy. But those categories are called genres. These are genres of books and movies. This next one, and I am is a little harder to explain. And this is going to be complicated. So let me read this out, and we'll try to tackle it. So an iam is a metric unit. So when it says metric unit, they're just saying it's something that you can use to count, right? You can have a iam, right? So it's a metric unit of poetic verse. So it has to do with poetry containing, so this is telling you what an iam contains. They're giving you the definition here. One unaccented syllable followed by an accented syllable. So I'm not sure why they used accented here. Usually in the other Edmentum lessons, they refer to it as stressed and unstressed. They even put it here, stressed and unstressed. So to try to break this down into the easiest way possible, there are two different, at least in English specifically, there are two different types of syllables. There's stressed, which have long sounds, and unstressed, which are short sounds. So I'm going to give you an example. Excuse me. I'm going to give you an example with the word table. Table has two syllables, right? Two sounds. That word can be broken down into two sounds, tay and bull. Now, if you pay attention to how your mouth moves when you form those words, you can kind of figure out which one is the longer one and which one is the shorter one. In English words, especially when we have short words, usually they're made up of one long sound and one short sound that kind of cuts itself off at the end, right? So table, if you say it slowly, table, right? The first syllable is longer. It stretches on. We have tay, right? It's not t, right? It's not tubble. It's table. That sound stretches, right? So that would be our stressed syllable. Stressed means long. The unstressed syllable is the short one. It's the one that would be cut off if you were talking quickly, right? Table. Bull kind of like cuts itself off at the end. Table. So we have one stressed syllable, tay, and one unstressed syllable, bull. Table. Now, when we get to longer words, like for example, if we are talking about like the word resources, right? Resources. Either way that you say it, that was kind of like a Southern pronunciation, right? But resources, right? So you can kind of tell once you start saying words slowly, which ones are stretched out. Resources. So re would be one of the longer syllables here. Resources. The middle part, source, kind of gets cut off by that last part. So we have a long syllable, a short syllable, and then a long one at the end. Resources, right? Sometimes you can have combinations of words that have like two long syllables connected and then a short one and things like that. But to keep it simple, an iam is specifically when you have one unstressed syllable, so like a short syllable, followed by a stressed syllable. So you start off with the short sound, and then you have a long sound. So that's it. And this doesn't really matter in terms of the type of words you're using. If it starts with an unstressed syllable, a short sound, and is followed by a long syllable, that is an IM. Now, when people write poetry, obviously you can't just pick 2-syllable words for your whole lines, right? Words in English have lots of different types of lengths, lots of different types of letters, lots of different types of syllables. But when you write poetry, you pick your words based on, at least old style poetry, you pick those words based on the pattern that you can get with what you fit together. So this leads to the iambic pentameter. This leads right into that. So pentameter, this first part of this word, penta, means 5. So we know that iambic is when we have one unstressed syllable and then a stressed syllable. That is the pattern. That is one iamb. Pentameter, penta means 5. So iambic pentameter is when you have this pattern of an unstressed syllable short and then a stressed syllable long, repeating 5 times. This is when this happens 5 times in a poetic line. Now you might be wondering, how do you get that 5 times? We didn't discuss how we do poetry if we're not just picking 2-syllable words all the time. So it's important to pay attention to the words that you're going to use in a line and break it down so that you can see which syllables are long and which syllables are short. And when you do that, basically you want to think of it sort of like connecting like cars of a train together. If you have a word, for example, that's 3 syllables, 1 short, 1 long, 1 short, what you'll want to do is mess around with your vocabulary and try to pick a word that starts with a long syllable to match with the other words in that line and keep it going. Now, this is part of the reason why poetry is so hard, because it actually takes time to examine, like look at words, break down the syllables, and figure out, at least if you're writing fancy poetry like they did back here, to figure out which words actually connect to keep the pattern going. Because if you have a word that ends with a long syllable and you connect it with a word that starts with a long syllable, then you've broken the pattern. It's not short, long anymore. So you have to pick your words carefully for your lines when you're trying to say something in poetry to make sure that you keep that pattern going. It's definitely, when you're writing in not just iambic pentameter, but there are other patterns for syllables. But when you're doing any of those, it's basically a big fancy game of keep it going. If you get to the middle of a line and you can't find a word that fits to keep that pattern going, then you've messed it up and it's not iambic pentameter anymore. So just try to remember that there's a rhythm, short, long, in terms of the syllables. And for the poem that we're looking at today, I think you'll be able to see it in action. So I'll hold off on giving you an example because I don't want to give you even more work to process. But for now, just remember an IM is when you have, it's basically measuring syllables, right? So you have one unstressed syllable, a short syllable, and then a stressed syllable, which is a long syllable. When you've got those 2 units next to each, or those 2 like syllables next to each other, that's 1 unit, that's 1 IM. Now, when you have a pattern that repeats that 5 times, that's when we get the pentameter here. Penta means 5. I do want to show you guys real quick. There is a resource that we have available, and you may want to ask your tutor or your advocate for it. I want to find it. There's a resource we have. It's a database. Now, this database has links to basically small PowerPoints that give you examples of these sort of things. So like it's color coded. This is the one for 11B. So I'm gonna go to 11As, right? So we can look, for example, at the lesson we're at, 1.4. So this would be the 4th lesson in that unit. But you have access to all of the English PowerPoints. So basically, I made these to help break down concepts that you might have forgotten for other English classes. So the point of me bringing this up in this video is if you ask your advocate or your mentor teacher for this link, you can actually go to the 9th grade stuff, and you can go and look at these PowerPoints. This does not open up a tutorial, right? That's not what happens. This does not open up a tutorial. It opens up straight up just a PowerPoint that has exactly what's on the title. So finding meter is the name of this one. And I'm bringing this up because it actually gives you the explanation of how to find meter, iambs, and all that stuff here. So this gives you the introduction to find the meter of the poem. You have to look at how the syllables are arranged in a line. We just talked about that. So this gives you an example. The syllables can be stressed, unstressed, or unstressed, stressed, right? So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at unstressed and stressed. That's what we're talking about right now. That is iambic, right? So here we get how to break down the meters, right? So we have pentameter, and we know that that's 5. We just went over that. But more importantly, it gives you examples of each one. So these are lines from actual poems. These come from other Edmentum tutorials. So if you're a student who's been with us before, you might not remember these, but they were in previous lessons. And they tell you down at the bottom which lessons they were from. If you were only with us for high school, then you might not have seen this before. So I put them all here so that students can look for exactly what they need and you can review it. So for example, pentameter is a line with 5 feet. So what they mean here by 5 feet is that the pattern that you're looking at repeats 5 times, right? So this is iambic pentameter because this starts with unstressed syllable, right? And then we have a stressed syllable. This stressed syllable is in bold. And as we break down this line, we have 5 pairs, right? So we have 2 syllables between each of these lines. And this repeats 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, right? So see how the syllables are broken down between words? My is 1 syllable and it's unstressed. My. Like if you're saying it, like with attitude, it might sound like my has like a long syllable, but usually if you say, I'm going to get my bike, right? You can hear how short the my sounds in that sentence. So it is unstressed. So in this case, it's my mistress's, right? My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. So we've connected the word mistress here because miss stretches out, miss. There's no way for you to say like mistress, right? You can't cut that short. You need the whole syllable. So this is actually a stress syllable. My mistress eyes, right, are nothing like the sun. So sometimes when we're dealing with like old style poetry, they like play around with the syllables just a little bit. But usually if you say it out loud, it makes it a little easier to tell what they were going for in terms of trying to keep this pattern. So for another example here, so we have mistress's eyes, right? The second part, eyes, is definitely a stress syllable. That I sound goes on very far. We only get the S at the very end. Eyes. The S at the end very short. So the EIE is carrying most of the sound for this whole word. So this is a stress syllable. And once we move here, we have R, right? R is short. It's just one sound. It doesn't stretch out. So we have to find another word, right, that starts with a stress syllable. So nothing. You could say nothing, right? But nothing, thing, has a lot of letters, but it's kind of like cut off when you run it together. When you say, even just think of how people from the South, for example, can say nothing, but without the G at the end, right? So we got nothing, ain't nothing going on. That sound stretches on, but the ing gets cut short. So that alone tells you that the NO here is the stress syllable, and the thing at the end is the unstressed syllable. So they connected these, nothing, having a longer syllable, attached it really to this R to keep the pattern going. Every other syllable is stressed. And there's other examples here. If snow be white, why then her breasts are done. So moving down here, just the pattern is what's most important. You want to keep that pattern going. So there you go. Just saying all of that to say that there's resources out there for you guys. You just have to ask for it. We do link them to you. These are in the resource courses. You can find them there if you are assigned the resource course. If you are not assigned the resource course, that just means you have to ask your contact person, your staff member, to get these. And the reason why we make them available when you guys ask is because if we overwhelm you with all of this stuff at the beginning of the year, when you first, get registered, you won't remember this. So I'm just letting you know, poetry is one of the hardest things for students in these English classes. So I just wanted you to know that there are breakdowns. There's videos on it here. There's 2 videos. We talk about sound in poetry, which gives you a little more of an in-depth kind of look at the syllable thing that we just talked about. We also have structure, which has to do with like different formats that poetry can be written in and that kind of thing. Types of poetry, pretty much anything that you need. There are other lessons that have to do with poetry in some of these classes. I think it's, 10A. I think it's mostly the A courses that have to do with poetry. Oh, nope, there's none in 10A. Let's see. Is it 10? Yeah, okay, it's 10B for this one. So, yep, some of these are just review of things that were in previous lessons. So I've just, if I think they're important or they add something, I've linked to them here. So back to the lesson, I just wanted to make sure you guys knew this was available. So now that we know an iamb, unstressed, then stressed. Pentameter, that pattern happens 5 times. Penta means 5. So now we're moving on to slide 11. And there's other concepts here that you should know before going into the lesson here. So we're talking about imagery. Imagery, I'll read the definition, but there's also a simpler way to think about it. It says here, descriptive language. So when you're describing something, that's descriptive, right? You want people to be able to understand and imagine what it is you're describing to them. That relies on sensory having to do with your senses, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, hands, touch, right? Those are your senses. So sensory details that help readers imagine the setting, characters, details, or of a story or poem. So imagery is when you describe anything in a way that's supposed to help a person imagine what's happening. And I know that a lot of the time this is kind of hard to grasp because people often think, oh, well, if I describe anything, that's imagery. But imagery is usually when you use a lot of sensory details. So there's a difference between you saying, oh yeah, this is my best friend is really tall, right? But if you want people to imagine this person, you have to give them more details than just about this person's height, right? You're going to want to describe like the shape of their eyes, like the color of their skin, the general size of the person. You can be tall and skinny, you can be tall and wide, you can be tall and curvy, right? What shape is their face? Is it like a diamond shape? Is it a circle, like a round face type? Do they have a square jaw? So imagery is when you are using things that are easy for people to remember, or pull from their own experiences to imagine what someone looks like. So if you say that someone has curly hair, that's one thing, sure. But what kind of curly hair? For it to be imagery, you would have to say something like, her hair is, her hair curves like the waves of the ocean in russet tones. So like russet is like a reddish brown, right? So when you put all of that together, you're explaining that the hair is more wavy than curly, right? Because we're literally talking about waves of an ocean. And you've described russet, which is like older language. We don't use that now. But in more creative like type stories, you would see that. You will reference lots of detailed colors. There's a difference between saying that something is yellow and saying something is school bus yellow, right? People know what color school buses are. So if you insert those kind of references into your story, people can pull from their own memory and say, like, oh, I get it now. I know what this is. If you say someone's hair is dark, that's different than saying, you know, like her or his hair is black and sits like a mop on his head, right? So like we all know what mops look like. They're kind of like messy, they kind of like bunched together, like the little threads bunched together. So you're describing not just the color but also how it sits, like it's messy, it's you know, that kind of thing. So imagery is usually when you are trying to provoke different parts of a person's ability to remember things that they've sensed, seen, heard, smelled. You know, you can say a house smells good, but you could also say this house smells like apple pie. If you've ever had apple pie, you'll know what the house smells like. So that's the point of imagery. It's to use things that are familiar to people in the time period that you're writing in so that they can imagine what is happening in your story. Okay. I spent a lot of time on the poetry and on the imagery, so we'll try to hurry it up. Literal language. Now, we just talked about literal language and figurative language earlier. Literal is when it is actually happening. That is an accurate description of what is going on. Figurative is when you use comparisons or other creative stuff like imagery, for example, to describe what's going on. The definition they give you here is language that expresses the primary meanings. That means like the first meanings, what you think of in a dictionary, rather than their implied or metaphorical meanings. So it's when you ignore the emotional associations you have with words just to interpret what is being said. That's what literal is. If you were to tell someone I touched the sun, they'd say you are a liar. There's no way that you could actually touch the sun, right? So that's not a literal statement. Hopefully that makes sense. The next one is a metaphor. A metaphor is a figurative, so it's not literal, a figurative comparison that does not use the words like or as. So again, yeah, it felt like I touched the sun, right? So we know you're touching something very hot, but you didn't say it was very hot. You said it felt like I was touching the sun. So that would be a metaphor. You were comparing the heat of the object that you've touched to the heat of the sun. Meter, we just talked about that. So this is a recurring means it happens over and over, pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem. It is the beat or rhythm of a poem. So that kind of back and forth, stressed, unstressed, stress, unstressed, going back and forth, that is called the rhythm of a poem. But it's basically when you break down those patterns in poetry, and not every poem has those patterns, but when they do, and you break them down, that creates a rhythm. Because basically you can compare the like every other syllable to kind of like a beat. Dun 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 dun, right? That's what we're thinking of. That's what they're trying to get to with poetry. It's almost, that's why poetry is like really good for songwriting, because you can choose words and syllables that go well with the beat of music or the rhythm of like a certain like melody. Mood here is something that's difficult for students sometimes. Mood is the feeling or emotion. It says prevailing, but prevailing means like overarching, the feeling that's supposed to be taking over. Prevailing means to take over or conquer. So the prevailing feeling or emotion of a literary work, also called atmosphere. So yeah, the mood is, what is this supposed to help you feel? If we're using words like dark, grim, sinister, eerie, right? Then that means that you're trying to make people feel creeped out by what they're reading, for example. So mood is like the description, or mood is the feeling that you would normally get from a movie when you look at the surroundings. So you can tell, for example, when you're watching a movie, if like the bright background is supposed to be happy-go-lucky, or if there's something that's supposed to be scary and suspenseful, or maybe the color of the room is blue to represent someone being sad or depressed. Maybe there's a lot of fighting happening, so there's a lot of like action, clashes, a lot of noise that's supposed to represent the fight that's going on. It's easy to see these things in a movie, but in a book, you have to choose words that help people picture those emotions. So, for example, if you're angry, You might write about a character screaming. You might write about a rage building up in the character that makes them want to harm the person in front of them. Maybe they want to, like if we're reading about two people who are fighting, or like if we're reading about like wolves fighting in the wilderness, maybe they're gnashing their teeth or slashing their claws. Maybe they're scrambling to avoid taking on damage, right? So these are words that we associate with like the tactical moves people make in a fight. So when you pick those words on purpose, that's what people think of. That's what mood is. It's when you pick words on purpose that are associated with how people feel. And you put them in there on purpose to help push them to feel what's happening in the story. Personification, it's figurative language, so it's not literal. We're talking more creative stuff. Describing something non-human by giving it human traits or abilities. So we'll go through this very quick example. The trees danced in the wind. Boom. Trees can't actually dance. It's literally impossible for them to do that. They're not sentient. They're not alive. They in the same, like they're not self-aware in the same sense that humans are. So they can't choose consciously to dance. But if you have a tree whose limbs or branches are like shaking in the wind, right? You could say that that tree is dancing. That would be a creative way to say it. Rhyme. We all know what rhyme is, right? It's words that begin with different sounds but end in the same sound. A rhyme scheme is the pattern of rhymes in a poem notated with lowercase letters. So basically, you can keep track of which lines rhyme within a poem. We usually assign all of the words at the end of a line that have the same sound with a lowercase letter. And you use the same letter to know any sounds in the poem at like at the end of the lines that are the same. So when you're done doing that and you've matched all the sounds that rhyme with each other, you use those letters to tell what the rhyme scheme is. It's basically an outline, a plan, like a list of which lines rhyme with which other lines. And that helps you understand if the poem has structure. Maybe the poem has a few different stanzas or paragraphs, but the stanzas have a pattern to how the lines rhyme with each other. So you will want to keep track of that by making notes about which lines rhyme with each other. Assonance. Assonance is the repetition, so that means something's repeating, of the same vowel sound. So vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y, not all the time. And this is followed by different consonant sounds. A consonant is any sound that's not a vowel. So vowels, A, E, I, O, U, those are vowels. Consonants, anything that's not a vowel. B is a consonant, P is a consonant, M is a consonant, R is a consonant. Anything that's not A, E, I, O, U, and Y. The reason why Y counts as both is because Y is sometimes used to make a vowel sound. So like my, for example, we use the letter Y to spell my instead of I, and we get a similar sound. But if you use Y at the beginning of a word, like yak, the letter Y is being used as a consonant. It's helping to form the sound of the vowel, that A in the middle. So it does both. And alliteration here, alliteration is when you repeat the same beginning sound in closely grouped words. So if you were to say, like, think of a tongue twister, right? Sally sells seashells by the seashore. That S sound repeats at the beginning of each of those words. So that's alliteration. Alrighty, so now that we've got that down, we've been recording for a little while. Sorry, but it's actually just important to get there. So now we're finally moving on to this actual poem. So slide 14 is where you can find this excerpt. It's just the excerpt from the poem. This is To a New England Poet by Philip Freneau. You can see this right here, just in case you were wondering. I'm not trying to move too fast for anyone, but I know that if you're here watching this video, you've probably gone through the tutorial before. And there's a lot of information to cover, before we even get to the poem. So they give you some information here at the top, which helps a lot. It says, keeping with traditional poetic form. So tradition is like how people do things, following rules and things like that. Poets who wrote during the Age of Reason used iambic meter. So that means that they follow the unstressed stress syllable pattern. And precise rhyme. So precise rhyme means that the words are both spelled the same or similarly, like very close, and they also sound the same. There were a few exceptions, but precise rhyme is when most of the words have the exact ending sounds. There are, like, if you've ever heard in rap or pop, some people will like twist the sounds of words so that they sound alike, even though they don't actually rhyme. Uh, that is a different type of rhyme, and they didn't really do this back at the time. The words actually had to have like the same sounds precisely, exactly, for them to be considered rhyming for the type of poetry that they wrote here. So they use this iambic meter, so that's the pattern we talked about before, and precise rhyme in conjunction, that just is a fancy word together. They use these together with imagery. So this strict style, strict, because think about it, they're calling it strict for a few reasons, right? So you have to have the imagery. So you're describing something in like flowery language. You have to have precise rhymes. So you can't do any partial rhymes or anything like that. The words at the end of your lines have to rhyme with other ones that are in the stanza. And you have to keep to that pattern of picking words that fit the unstressed and then stressed syllable thing. So you have to follow all of those rules at this time to write what people would call a good poem. So that's a lot of rules to follow. If you've ever tried to write a song or write your own rap lyrics and you want to try to fit things within, like fit words within the beat, you know that it's hard just finding words that will fit the beat you're going for, let alone trying to like having rules about what you're trying to describe and if everything actually has to rhyme on beat too. So just try to think of it that way while you're going through it. They're balancing a whole lot of things while they are trying to tell a story, right? So this excerpt, I'm going to read it through first, and then we'll go back over it. So we have, Dear Bard, I pray you take the hint in England, what you write in print. Republished here in shop or stall will perfectly enchant us all. It will assume a different face and post your name at every place. From splendid domes of first degree where ladies meet to sip their tea, from marble halls where lawyers plead, or congressmen talk loud indeed, to huts to where evening clubs appear and squires resort to guzzle beer. So this poem is pretty self-explanatory if you know what these words mean. So a bard is someone who writes songs about people, writes poems, and plays music. If you've ever played D&D or if you have some nerdy friends, you might have heard the word bard somewhere. They are referring to exactly that. A bard is someone who writes poetry, writes music, and performs. That's their job. So it says, take the hint. So the person who is considered the narrator for this poem is telling a bard to take a hint. And they mean hint the way that you would normally think of it. And it says, in England, what you write in print. So they're telling them to be careful and read between the lines, right? About what they write and what they print. So that means what type of stuff they write, who they write about, all of that. Republished, that means that someone literally republicates or puts out what they write again. In shop or stall. So when they mean stall, they mean like basically kind of like pop-up shops. They would call those stalls. So if you ever been to New York and you've seen like little carts and stuff, or people that have like small designated spaces to do business, like they don't own the place, but they can pop up and sell. That's what a stall is basically. So republish here and stop or shop or stall will perfectly enchant us all. So to enchant means to like charm someone. It will assume a different face and post your name at every place. So it will assume a different face means that it will look different, right? So when they republish something, it'll look different. It'll be taken differently. Everyone can read into what you're writing differently, regardless of what you put. You could think about when you send a text and someone thinks they know what you've said and you have to correct them, right? It's even worse when you publicize like a book. Think of like videos that people put out now. Sometimes people have to put out apology videos or post second videos to like clarify what they meant because other people can take it in a different way. That's not great. So it will assume a different face is just referring to how it can seem different once you put something out there. And post your name at every place. So that means that regardless of how someone's reading what you've posted or published, your name is associated with that and it'll be everywhere for good or bad. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. So then we have from splendid domes of first degree. So a dome is like a half circle. So if you've ever seen, like I think it's hard to find domes these days unless they're, what am I thinking of? Unless they're like sports centers or there are a lot of religious buildings that have domes. So it's basically when the top of the building has like a circle shape instead of the normal square shape that we have in a lot of US architecture. There are a lot of buildings, especially in England, that have domes or domed roofs, circular type roofs. So splendid domes of first degree probably means like churches. There are also some government buildings that are domed as well, but they're basically talking about fancy buildings. And you can tell that they mean like fancy, important buildings. Even outside of, you know, things like churches or things like that, basically old sophisticated buildings. You can tell they mean this because this is where ladies meet to sip their tea. So there are a lot of like old buildings that are repurposed into like social clubs and things like that. That sort of thing happens. And post your name at every place from splendid domes of first degree where ladies meet to sip their tea. So they're talking about the different types of people who might come across the things you write. From marble halls where lawyers plead, so they're talking about courts, or congressmen talk loud indeed. So indeed just means like it is so. Yes, this is a thing that happens. Indeed is like confirming. It's like a fancy yes. So congressmen talk loud, so we're talking about government. And then we have two huts where evening clubs appear. So we're talking about like bars and pubs and places where people party. And squires resort to guzzle beer. So squires, esquires are a type of lawyer, to be honest. But squires are also people who serve. So like it depends on how you're taking it. A squire is someone who's training to be a knight under like a king. Esquire is what they call basically people who practice law in England. And it is a title that you can also get by special means, like the queen can make you an esquire. It means you're basically considered to be like a very important person to the crown. So with all of this being said, they're basically just saying, be careful what you write in print because it will travel and other people will see it. People can take it differently, no matter where it's posted. It can be posted in a social club where people are eating. It can be posted in a bar. It can be posted in a club. It can be posted in where people are doing law. You don't know how far your work is going to reach. And now, today, it's kind of, I want to say outdated to say something kind of like this, because usually if things are not super popular, you don't see them. But this was also during a time where the printing press was still kind of new. So everyone was kind of reading everything at this time. Like the printing press had been out for like a little while, but it was still fairly new. At least in terms of, I guess I'll say it was new in terms of like industrial printing. So before people were like copying things by hand or they had like stamps that could be made to reprint, but this was during the time where like machines that could put out a lot of books at once were finally made. So this is important. Now we got all this meaning just from, you know, these few lines. And none of that actually includes the actual structure of uh of the poem. So we have a lot of rhyming going on. We have hint and print, stall and all, face and place, degree and tea, plead, indeed, appear and beer, right? So all of these had to be written so that these N words rhymed, right? On top of that, we have iambic pentameter happening. Dear Bard, I pray you take the hint, right? So you can take these syllables and actually break them down into those groups of 5 that we were talking about, right? So this would be 1, I pray would be 2, you take, I'm sorry, sorry. Dear Bart would be 1. I pray would be 1, and we have you here. I pray you. We have take, that's all one thing, so that's 4, and then we have the hint, right? 1, 2, yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have all of these syllables going back and forth. And basically when you go through here, let me see, let me count these one more time because I just want to make sure. Dear Bard, I pray you take the hit. Okay, no. This is tetrameter. I'm sorry. This is groups of 4. Dear Bard, I pray you take, that's 3, and then the hint. Sorry. So that is tetrameter. And it should be somewhere down here. Notice how he creates imagery through the descriptions of social scenes in the United States. Yes, he forms these details within measured lines of iambic tetrameter, or an iambic rhythm repeated 4 times in a line. So if you break these down into syllables, you have this repeating 4 times, right? And this one line has a lot of 1 syllable words that are put together, but there are other ones, perfectly, for example, down here, will perfectly. So perfectly has 3 syllables. This first part, per, is being paired with will. So we have will perfectly, that's our second group. Enchant, that's our third group. And then us all is our 4th group. So if you go through and break this down, we have the unstressed and then stressed pattern, and it repeats 4 times. That's tetrameter. So he's going through this, writing this under all of these rules. And he's also describing, on top of that, all the different types of people who are going to see the things that you write. He's using the different types of people, where ladies meet to sip their tea, from marble halls where lawyers plead. And then he talks about the congressmen, he talks about the evening clubs, and he talks about people who guzzle beer. These are all pictures that people can actually imagine in their head. If you were a part of English society, you knew people who would post up at tea places and sort of gossip with their friends. You knew people who would be in Congress doing work, poring over laws and trying to pass things or block other things from being passed. You knew what it was like to walk into a pub and have people, you know, guzzle beer after work because they're stressed out or because they're tired or they want to hang out with their friends and have fun. So this is imagery. This is very light imagery, but you can still picture these people in these places, you know, pinkies up with the tea, sipping in like a bright, well-lit place. Maybe they're in fancy dresses. The fact that you can imagine and picture that in your head, and that's what you think of when you see the description of it, is what makes it imagery. Now it says here, the excerpt also uses couplets to organize the lines into pairs. So again, couplets are a set of 2 lines that rhyme with each other. And we just went through how these are pairs of lines, right? Hint and print, stall and all the way on down. These are groups of 2 lines at a time that rhyme with each other. So this is basically a paragraph, a stanza, in poetry, that's made up of couplets all put together that tell a story. So it says here he creates uniformity. That means that everything is the same. It's working towards the same goal. They're all following the same rules. Uniformity of imagery, meter, and rhyme, which he sustains. That means he keeps it going throughout the poem. There's no part of this that's wrong or that doesn't fit. he tweaked this and messed with the words until he got it exactly the way he wanted, following all of the rules, and he made absolutely no exceptions. And I think that is actually about it for this one. Yes, there's just this one excerpt. Now, this isn't even the whole poem. This is just an excerpt of the poem. So there's more here. He did this for way longer while he was telling this story and talking about what writing and publishing is like. So imagine all that work, going into a poem. That's basically what everyone was doing at the time. And if you were a good writer, you could do it well. Alrighty, that is it for this reading resource review. I hope that this helped you not only understand this poem, but also the different ways that people wrote poetry back in the day. If you have any questions, feel free to book a tutoring session with me or Kathy Bahovic, any of the English tutors. You can also ask your advocate to book a tutoring session for you. But other than that, this is Miss Amber. Good luck with the rest of your English class.